So, Chris, I think the first thing that would be really useful if you kind of introduce yourself, but if you could do that by saying a little bit about, maybe say a bit about your sort of career pathway and where you started and all the rest of it, and then kind of land us with the current role. Let us know what you do.
Yeah, so I'm sort of, I mean, I feel like my career pathway is a sort of series of failures. So I'm sort of jumping the gun slightly. So I'll probably come back to some of this. Um, I was originally going to be a psychologist. That was the plan, and I did a PhD in psychology to support becoming a psychologist, and that didn't really work out, and I kind of fell into sort of processing data. There was this survey. I worked in a Nottinghamshire Healthcare NHS Trust for a long time. I was processing a lot of survey data, and there was more and more and more survey data, and we were getting more and more overwhelmed with it. And I heard about this thing called R, which is like a statistical programming language, in case anyone in the familiar audience is not familiar. So I started building stuff with R, started processing the data, and then I was like, oh, you can build reports with it, or you can build websites with it, or you can do this. And then I just started calling myself a data scientist. Data science wasn't really a word in the NHS, but I decided, I think around 2018, that I was a data scientist, and so I was just going to start calling myself that. And yes, and now for the last 2 years, I've joined the strategy unit as the head of data science. So I've ended up finally here.
No, there's some case study there, declaring yourself to be something, and then eventually it winds up in your job title. And in fact, not only do you get to be the head of the thing that you've just decided that you are. So that doesn't look very much like a failure to me. Say a bit about what you currently do. What's the current gig? What's the responsibility? What's the role? You've got a little team.
Yeah, so at the moment, the team has been growing rapidly ever since I arrived. So when I arrived, it was just two, really. We're up to kind of 8 or 9 now, depending on how you count people. So at the moment, we're basically working on a large acute model for demand and capacity modeling as part of the new hospital program. And it requires a big team doing a lot of kind of sophisticated things. So I think the thing I like about being at the strategy unit is that often data scientists and other organizations have to do everything because of the kind of the size of the outfit. But the strategy unit contains a lot of really excellent analysts who are not data scientists. So we kind of concentrate on doing kind of GitHub back deployment and kind of Azure and Docker. We do very sort of data sciencey things rather than getting kind of caught up in sort of data management and all that kind of thing.
That's cool. I think it's useful for me and maybe for others then to note that the kinds of things that you're getting thrown at are the sort of non-obvious set of problems in professional life. And so, we'll see as we roll ahead. But my guess would be at the outset that it will be beset with what we might think of as failure. But so I want to talk to you about examples of failure, and then progressively we'll I'm assuming develop a sort of set of themes and all the rest of it. So at the end, I'd like to return to this whole thing about what we even mean when we're talking the language of failure. But would you start me out with some, I guess, like examples would be useful. So examples of failure in your, maybe keep this professional, examples of failure in sort of professional life, things that you've attempted to do that have just not played out in the way that you wanted it to. So maybe just offer me an example.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, it's quite difficult this in a way, I think, because failure is quite a loaded word, isn't it? So I feel like if I say this is a failure, then it almost kind of implies that it stayed being a failure, if you see what I mean. And I don't know if I really have any stories that involve a sort of catastrophic failure and then nothing afterwards. So I think I just thought I'd just sort of flag that as, and that's kind of what I want to say later on, I think, really, is just like the whole language of failing, the whole way we think about it and the whole way we manage it, I think is really unhelpful, which obviously is, that's kind of the whole theme of the day, isn't it, really? But yeah, I mean, I think the most obvious example of failure, I would say, and a failure that I very much kind of embrace and value, is the fact that I was not supposed to be here at all. I wasn't supposed to, well, I mean, this job didn't exist, of course, when I went to university, but I dreamed for a long time about being a psychologist. I think I came up with that idea when I was about 14. I've always just been interested in kind of just human suffering, really. I wanted to do something to kind of reduce the amount of human suffering in the world, and being a psychologist seemed like an excellent way of doing that. So I did a degree in psychology for that reason, and then I did a PhD in psychology for that reason. And I got some interviews with the clinical psychology training course. And that they were, I think I can say that, yes, I suppose this is an example of a catastrophic failure in the sense of I didn't get anywhere with any of them. And one of the courses that I applied to, and this will probably stay with me until my dying day, actually wrote in my feedback that they had serious concerns about my capacity for empathy, which is probably one of the worst things that anyone has ever said to me for any reason in my entire life. And it was about my long-held dream that I've been working towards for probably about 10 years by that point. I don't think I do have a significant problem with capacity for empathy. Nobody that I know has told me that. But that did not work at all. But precisely because it did not work, I ended up doing something different and straight away felt more comfortable, more happy, more able, and so yeah, I think it got diverted immediately from that path into something that I was fascinated with, from right immediately, and still am.
Tell me, thank you, Chris. I just, I know it's not, I know it's not my job to reduce the stock of suffering in your world, but you've never struck me as someone that lacks empathy. So there you go. I'm very interested in the sort of, because there's almost the direct experience of failure at the time that you think you're experiencing it, and the sort of deeply unpleasant sort of emotional valence that it brings. So I'm imagining you applying to these things and wanting them because you'd set your heart on them for the previous near decade and you'd worked hard towards them, and you don't come about a PhD by some trivial set of efforts, do you? You come about them because you've applied yourself and you've wanted and desired something. And then the sort of pot of gold at the end of all of that, in terms of actually getting into the roles and onto the courses, just doesn't materialize for you. I mean, to the extent that you mind sharing what that experience was like, I'm guessing it was deeply unpleasant. So it's not, I mean, there's a way of telling it, oh, I tried this, it didn't work, and then I've tried something else. But the experience of it, what was it like?
Yeah, well, I think, yeah, I mean, and that's the point, isn't it? And that's I think what is a failure. As I say, it doesn't stay a failure. But yeah, it's just, I mean, there are lots of examples, and I'm sure I'll give other examples later, of just that feeling of just being completely crushed. You put your heart and soul into something. I think also in particular when it involves, and this is another example, I think, where we really struggle with failure, where it involves someone else making a judgment about you. I think that's what's even worse. Like if you try and do something, go out on your skateboard and think, oh, I'm going to do a 360 shove it or whatever it is, and you fall over and you feel stupid. But it's much worse, isn't it, to be, have someone else to say, oh no, not only are we not going to let you on the course this time, but we think you're awful, kind of thing.
Yeah, that's good. The skateboarding example is nice. I remember my teenage shins were full of bruises because of the immediate feedback of that thing. And in a sense, it's quite objective feedback in that circumstance, isn't it? But then we look at what professional life is characterized by. So your professional life producing great data science models for things, it's not like getting a bruise on your shin, is it? It's very difficult to work out what success and failure might be because you're breaking new ground very often. And even if people are judging and passing comment on what you're doing, you've also got the question of their ability to comment on the thing that you've done. So it's much more ambiguous, it seems to me. Can you give me, let me take us away from skateboarding. Can you give me an example from professional, perhaps analytical life, of something that you've done? Again, here we are raising our eyebrows at this whole world failure, but something that at the time you did it, you encountered it as a failure.
Well, I think the example I gave of my kind of some of the early stuff I was doing around survey data would definitely be an example, because I was just completely ill-equipped. It was one of those, I think the thing is, I think what I started out doing, which was basically using a series of Excel macros to analyze a survey, made sense at the scale that they were conceived, and didn't make any sense at all at the scale that they ended up. And that scale was brought to very rapidly. And the consequence of that failure was, I can't even quantify it, hundreds of person hours of work, not by me, by me and others. Basically this enormous project that couldn't fail, wasn't allowed to fail, but nonetheless was a failure in the sense of it was totally misspecified, not working properly, incredibly laborious, error prone. Had all the characteristics of a failure, while not being allowed to actually be taken outside and, you know, humanely put down.
So take me, and we're talking there about the spreadsheets, aren't we? So take me into the detail of that example. So you know, give me a sense of what it is the survey responses were about, and give me a sense of the scale that you entered into and the processes that you were doing, and then just let me know the moment at which it becomes obvious that the dam's burst, and then that is you know, you and your team are being swept off down the valley by the scale of the thing. Just take me into the detail of that example.
Yeah, so well, it was a quarterly survey. It was patient experience data. So my trust of their lasting credit started down the patient experience train long before NHS England mandated it, which is, you know, greatly to their credit. So we just started off, and that's partly why I got involved, because my PhD was partly to do with kind of psychometric theory and survey design and all that kind of thing. So I got involved, and it just started small because, you know, projects start small. Nobody really cared about it. Nobody really knew about it. So we had, I don't know, maybe 100 responses from service users and patients per quarter. And you pop them onto an Excel sheet, press a few buttons, you know, run the report off and send it to the interested party. And, you know, that's all fine. I think probably so we did that, I think, for 2 quarters. And then by the third quarter, and the thing, I mean, I suppose in a sense you could say almost this failure was a victim of its own success. And that's what I mean. These concepts are mixed together so much, aren't they? Precisely because the stuff that other people were doing was successful in the sense of people wanted this, people were doing the right engagement, you know, it was a successful project in that sense. Precisely for that reason, the amount of data, well, I don't know what the multiple of, but way more than I ever conceived of, and way more than I could ever deal with. And so basically a huge system was set up around my horrible mess that involved other people doing lots and lots of very boring, repetitive work. I think the whole cycle probably took about 2 weeks every quarter.
Yikes, that's horrible. There's something in there. There's something I want to share. You just reminded me of a wonderful early professional failure where I ran a postal survey. Funnily enough, much of it would have been going around the area you were actually sitting in. I think quite a few victims of my survey were in Nottingham. I ran it as a postal survey and failed to put enough on the stamps. So there was and it was quite a few. I mean, I might have sent 50 out, and there were loads of little SMEs, you know, getting notes from the post office that they had something to collect that some mug hadn't put enough postage on. So they were traipsing off to pay the thing and then getting my survey, and then I was getting some slightly angrier responses. So relative to your failure, I feel like I've managed to undercut that example slightly. And there's something in yours that gives me a bit of pain, which is that you inflicted some professional damage on colleagues that way. So in your example, someone else is helping you to bail that one out. So there's something in that moment as well where you're presumably feeling some sort of like, oh, this is bad for me, this is absolutely horrible, and also I've managed to inflict this pain on other people.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of I think I might have subconsciously brought that out because that's one of the things that I think is very particularly crushing about failure. So the more up-to-date example would be in my current role, some of the early kind of project management decisions I made about, as I say, we're building this very complicated model. Lots and lots of people want lots and lots of things from it, you know, lots of stakeholder input and all this kind of stuff. And just wasn't ready for I want to say we weren't ready. That's not really fair. I wasn't ready for the amount of changes and the amount of pressure and, you know, all that kind of thing. But the thing is, in that kind of a role, those mistakes that I was making ripple out to other people, and that's what can be so difficult. And that again is another reason why it's so difficult to talk about failure, because what you have to be saying is, you know, that thing that's happening at the moment, that's my fault. I did that.
Tell me, just elaborate on that example a little bit more. As I said earlier, one of the things I'm really interested in with that example, and with, I guess, with most of the work that you and your team will be doing anyway, is it's just going to be characterized by you're just breaking ground every which way you turn. It's not as though, oh, you know, here's some well-trodden path that we can just, you know, march gently down. At every point, presumably, you're trying to work out, are we going the right way with this? How will we push this? Yikes, that's not played out very well. How do we regroup? So there's something about, and again, I can feel the word failure dissolving here. There's something about that environment that is about trying, failing, getting a bit of feedback, reshaping, and going on. Can you just again take us a bit more into this example, and just help me see some of the some of the very nature of what you're doing just being beset with things just not working, but that's the nature of it.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, it's sort of similar to the story I told before, I think, in a sense, in that what happened basically was we were set up for a particular pace of work and a particular set of objectives. And kind of through no fault or through external factors, that pace of work and that set of objectives changed very alarmingly. And yes, my inability to kind of, filter those things, respond to those things, understand those things, triage, whatever, led to basically just chaos. We were working under conditions of chaos for probably about 3 or 4 months. And yeah, it's not a pleasant working environment. I mean, we got the job done. I suppose that's the other thing that I think there's another two kinds of failure, isn't it? In the sense of there are failures where the project is successful, but everybody is miserable. That is a failure, but we don't often think about that, do we? And there are other failures where, the project just fails. It doesn't work at all. And fortunately, we were we did what we were supposed to do. But in the process of doing that, I mean, I wouldn't say I made everybody miserable. That's maybe putting it a bit strongly. But certainly I didn't do what I could and should have done in order to make it work better. I mean, to your point about doing new things, I mean, that's partly what I think the thing is, like, that I'm so enthusiastic about failure. That's why I really wanted to say something in this session, because everything I've ever done that's valuable, I haven't sort of copied it. I've always felt completely adrift. And that's not because other people are not doing similar things, or it's not because I'm the first to, it's nothing like that. It's just, it's really hard to look out into the world and see examples like that. So I knew the whole time, I mean, I've been torturing myself for the last 2 years, knowing that somebody out there has got these answers. Somebody out there has done this thing that I'm doing, and they know, and they can tell, oh, don't do this, but I never found that person. And that's been true really ever since I was told I didn't have enough empathy and went down this path. I've constantly been doing something that I don't know how to do and I'm frightened about, and I really want to reach out to someone and say, look, what do I do? And I've never really had that. And I think that's part of, like, that's a world I want to see now. I want to see a world partly where people talk about failure, but also partly as part of that, just share what they're doing better and just get into a conversation about what works and what doesn't, precisely because I've had that experience of just being like, I don't know what, I mean, it's a very familiar feeling to a lot of people, isn't it? But just this constant feeling of, I don't know what I'm doing.
That's excellent. Okay, so let's just sort of go there then and get your reflections on what we might even mean by failure and its value and all the rest of it. So just let's take a step back and think about failure in the round. Just to sort of get us there, there's something that you started touching on there that I'm really interested in, which is about leading, and it's about leading analytical teams as well, I suppose, under conditions where there's both really high uncertainty over what you're doing because you haven't found the person who can tell you what to do. So you need to acknowledge that, and whatever it is that you're doing in work has to just be full of the experience of uncertainty. And yet no one wants that feeling in day-to-day working life. And in particular, if I'm fresh at an early career and I'm looking at you, Chris, you can't tell me that it's all chaos and uncertainty. That's going to scare the bejesus out of me. So there's something you've got to give me, which is a sufficient sense of confidence that I feel compelled that we'll give this thing a go, whilst also acknowledging that it's uncertain and that we're going to get things wrong. So do you mind telling me a little bit about sort of leadership under that circumstance, and maybe also some of the psychology of leadership?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know if I get this right actually, but I'm just going to say it out loud anyway, and people can come to their own conclusions about whether I get it right or not. I feel like I actually lean too far the other way. So I generally trust people who say, I don't know, I've done this wrong, I'm not sure. I personally find it's a bit like, I mean, we have this problem with politics, don't we? A politician can never make a mistake. They can never go back on what they've said. They always have to be like, oh, well, I didn't mean that, or all that kind of thing. And that's very untrustworthy, isn't it? We all know that the typical politician, that's a very untrustworthy. So I feel like I sort of lean very far the other way in terms of, I mean, my team, I think some of them are probably listening to me say this, know that I do it privately a lot, actually. I really want them to know that I don't know a lot of, to remind them basically that not only do I not understand all the clever technical things that they're doing, but I also don't always even have a good picture of everything that's going on. So I think just rehearsing that idea of I'm operating on a condition of uncertainty. I've never done this before. I don't know. I'm not sure. There are competing interests here. I think I personally think it builds trust, but I might be wrong. It might actually. I've always wondered whether people actually just think I'm an idiot. I think it's definitely one or the other. They either think I'm trustworthy or I'm just an idiot and don't know what I'm doing. One or the other. And I think, the other thing I think that does is obviously it allows other people to do the same. I mean, that's the other thing that I want to do. I think the worst teams in the world, and I don't know whether I've never really done anything else except what I'm doing now, but like certainly in the world of analytics, I know there's a lot of managers who you're not allowed to make mistakes. There are no mistakes in their team. They don't talk about mistakes outside of their team, and anybody that makes a mistake the attitude basically is you should not have made that mistake. You will be punished severely. And I just think that is such a completely that misunderstands human nature so completely. In my team, we always say mistakes are inevitable. They are absolutely inevitable because we're human beings. And, I try to promote a really healthy culture in my team of just making a mistake, just going, I've just made a mistake just now. And I think it's a more pleasant experience for people to work under, but also it allows you to find and fix the mistake more quickly than this is what you get. You see, you get analytical teams for 3 months trying to cover something up, and eventually the dam breaks, and then you lose all your credibility.
That's fascinating, Chris. There's a couple of things you've made me think. One is about this process of doing what I think you're describing, which is kind of working out loud and letting everyone around you know where the bounds of your knowledge and competence might be, relative to people who bluster and say you don't really know where the bounds are. And I was thinking as you were talking, people who've really burnt me career-wise, they're not very many occasions, but the times where I feel like I've been burnt, it's people who've blustered and failed, and then you find out what the bottom looks like, and it was nowhere near where you thought it was, and then lo and behold, off you go digging, and you're trying to. Whereas people who, I've got a sort of little line where I think I would say something like, I don't trust people without some sense of imposter syndrome. It's the people who are quite acutely aware of the limits of what they're doing. So when things fail, it fails within a bound that you know about because you've been talking about it. Is that what you're doing?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just about being transparent, isn't it? Like I'm really into the idea of like open code, which is something that I would bang on about in a different webinar. And what people often say about that is like, oh, what if I've made a mistake? There's this big thing about like, and I think that's interesting for two reasons. Number one, you probably have made a mistake, really, haven't you? If you've written like 4,000 lines of code, I imagine there's probably a mistake in there. So don't you take that off the table straight away. But I think the other thing is that and that relates to what I was saying before, there's this fear not of almost, they've run a model, they've done some analysis, and this has had a real world effect, and they sort of don't mind if there's a mistake in the real world effect. What they mind is someone seeing it, which again is completely reverses what you should have, isn't it?
Isn't that incredible? So there's something that there's a different lens on this. There's one way of regarding failure through the individual lens, which is that person made a mistake. And there's another way of regarding it collectively, which is we really want to know about individual mistakes, so collectively we can benefit from them. So the individual has an incentive to hide, but collectively we want to know. And I guess that, there's so much of science and medicine that's built upon that premise, isn't there, I suppose?
I think the thing is, individuals make mistakes. That's what I want to say. Individuals make mistakes. They screw up. But an organization shouldn't, because an organization should have the right processes and the right procedures and the right audit and the right whatever. It depends what, are we flying a plane or brain surgery, whatever it is, the context that they work in should mitigate mistakes that they make, which is very opposite. As I say, I've seen loads of examples where it's the other way around. The system around them doesn't help them with mistakes at all. It just punishes them. And they just pretend as if what you've got to do is just basically make everyone perfect. Make everyone perfect, and then there won't be any mistakes, which just will never work. And it's also it gives this horrible feeling we were talking about before to the people, like, oh, I failed. I've done this wrong, and now I'm going to get, ton of bricks thrown at me.
And also, don't you know, the ambient buzz of sort of like threat and adrenaline is not actually that good for your performance when you're doing anything anyway, is it? Can I ask you that as a final question then, which is just about leading teams in being a leader in an organization, and also you could maybe take this broader. You could maybe think about the profession more generally. Analytical data science type profession. Is that what do you think is needed to really extract the value from failure?
Yeah, well, as I say, I mean, I do think I've been very inspired. I think the other reason why I've come to failure so much is I've been inspired by the kind of work of kind of the world of software development. So as a data scientist, that's a big kind of part of what I've kind of looked at and studied. And in software development has this very, it's very, it's much more kind of rigid than kind of analysis. Thing like your code either runs or it doesn't. Basically, it's kind of like a bit of it's a bit more of a kind of black and white type of a situation. And in a software development world, the idea basically is that it will fail. Like everything fails. Everything Google does fail. All your software fails. Writing code is an experience, basically just constant, utter, crushing failure. And at the end of it, you built a huge software base, which is too big and doesn't run on the software anymore and needs rewriting in a completely different language because it's taken you so. Like that is just completely the part of it. So I think what I've taken from that is this idea of, well, firstly, open source. Firstly, just being honest about your mistakes and showing your methodology, and not because you think it's perfect. That's not what open source doesn't mean. I challenge you to find a single mistake in this. It doesn't mean that at all. It just means I'm comfortable with people looking at what I've done in a critical way and wherever I'm in my career, however good I am, and bringing anything to my attention. It's a different attitude, isn't it? But I think the other thing is just bringing out failure. So the worst in software, the worst thing that can happen is to fail quietly. So as I mentioned, in sort of badly performing teams, that's the strategy. Fail. It doesn't matter if you fail, as long as nobody knows, that's fine. Fail quietly. Whereas in the software engineering context, you build a lot of tests in your code. You don't let a server just go on and on and on and on, chunking out the same rubbish over and over again. You test it, and that's a fundamental part of the whole approach. So I think for us, that's I think what we need to learn from, basically. Firstly, looking for mistakes, identifying them, blaming processes rather than individuals, and sharing them. I mean, we have the file drawer effect, don't we, in research? Like people do stuff that doesn't work and they just put it in a drawer and forget about it. And I think we have the same thing in analytics as well. And I've tried. I mean, it's really hard to do this, but I have done some bits and pieces of work with others in my team where we've done stuff that hasn't worked, and we've tried to put that on the GitHub repo. We've tried to say, we did this, it doesn't work, so don't try, basically. I mean, try if you like. Well, you can see the code, so don't feel put off. But as far as we can tell, that method does not work in this scenario.
Oh, that's excellent. That's absolutely excellent. Chris, thank you so much.